I know this is going to be a little bit of a different format than what you're typically expecting, but I really wanted to talk about this patch and the impact that's going to have on Diablo 4 moving forward. Because a lot of what I'm seeing online is that it's absolute trash and you might as well throw it all in the fire. And while I understand that, I truly do, I think that there was a lot of overcorrection here for specific builds as opposed to the overall theme or the overall ideology that went into this patch. I definitely agree with that. But I do think that this is ultimately incredibly healthy for Diablo 4, and we're going to look back at this drastic change with appreciation, or at least I know that I am going to, because it is very easy for an ARPG to get away from the developers incredibly quickly, and for bloat and power creep to become massive problems. I know this is a little bit of a different format, right? This is just like random stock footage from when I was fighting Lilith right before the patch dropped, but it's roughly 11 p.m. at night. I have work in the morning, too much work to get done between now and before I go to sleep, and it's disgustingly hot where I live right now, so I'm just kind of chilling here, can't be recording myself because I'm just a hot mess. But I wanted to talk about the overarching ideology, what I see in this patch, because I truly see this almost like a cry for help from the developers, because a couple things stood out to me very quickly from reading the changes that they put into this. One, the developers did not expect us to clear through the content at the rate that we did. Now, we can go back and forth about whether or not there should have been more time developing. You know, we all understand that the video game industry forces developers to pump out games way ahead of schedule because you have capitalistic shareholders waiting to make their money, and developers are, in most circumstances, trying to make the best art that they possibly can. Now, I promise this entire video isn't just going to be an apology letter for the developers. Your reactions and your feelings about how the game currently works or how the nerfs impact you personally are all valid concerns, but I'm just hoping that people try to take like a bigger picture approach to what we really got here. Let's take a look at the biggest change, the one that absolutely has the most impact on this game as a whole. The developers just took survivability and slashed it across the entirety of all stats. For all intents and purposes, they just said you take 30% more damage. By reducing damage reduction on every single gear piece across the board, reducing disobedience ability to be able to generate armor for your character, it is very clear that they didn't expect people to be able to survive this content. Take this Uber Lilith fight, for example. Sure, I'm getting one shot by spike walls whenever that happens, but when Lilith does her wing attack, I don't need to move. When she does that crisscrossing fire attack, I don't need to move. When she summons the monsters that come out and attack you, their damage is literally inconsequential. There was no universe where they expected people to just be able to face tank Lilith, just be able to go and clear tier 100 Nightmare dungeons across multiple builds on multiple characters, and they probably assumed most people wouldn't even get to level 100 in hardcore. Realistically, look at how long that took already, because the game is pretty challenging until you get a really good hand on its mechanics. I think that's quite clear that the developers really thought that the end game content that currently exists in Diablo 4 was going to present more of a challenge, and it sadly just has not. Now let's talk about the damage nerfs, because here's the interesting part. If you weren't personally playing Bone Spear Necromancer or the ridiculous Druid builds, or insert the OP build that needed to get nerfed at this point, you should take a look at what people have been saying online. 1, vulnerable is too strong, everybody's too reliant on it. 2, crit is too strong, the multipliers are too high. We don't want this to be like Diablo 3, the numbers are getting too high. And while I personally don't care how high the numbers get because it's completely arbitrary, I will agree that before the first season even releases and we're getting 36 quadrillion damage crits, and when something isn't even that ridiculous, we're still getting 3 billion damage hits on druids, I think we should all be willing to step back and say, hey, you know what? The damage numbers are probably a little bit too high, considering we haven't even gotten the first set of seasonal content, which promise to add a ton of super powerful new socketable items to the game. So when we look at the nerf to critical strike damage and we look at the nerf to vulnerable damage, while the numbers are big and scary, it's actually a very measured approach to how these things work. They reduced crit and vulnerable stats on gear. It's not like they went into your Paragon tree and gutted the exploit glyph. It's not like they went and took your legendary node and cut it in half. They redistributed what the relative value of damage and efficiency your build can gain from one system to another system. Now, it's a little bit myopic to say that the Malignant Hearts are going to somehow fix all these problems because the Eternal Realm literally exists right over there and we'll never see them. But one of the big things I saw personally in my own chat, since I do play the Necromancer, was other Bone Spear players coming in and going, my build is dead, it's garbage, I can't play, I quit the game. This is unironically a message that I received from multiple people all throughout the stream. Now, if you're being realistic about the damage reduction on Bone Spear Necromancer, it was about a 40% damage reduction, kind of across the board. I was running tier 60 dungeons with my exact same build, and while I wasn't one-shotting every single monster, sometimes I had to cast Decrepify before I one-shot the monster. Look at the fact that it wasn't just a set of nerfs to, one or two important sets of stats, but was also a buff to the additive bucket stats that exist in the game. They clearly realized that there was a power disparity, there was a disproportionate weight given to some damage numbers in the game, and not enough ability to be able to counteract that or to offset it or balance it with the other damage stats that they had in the game. Look at any build guide. None of them are recommending plus to shadow damage on your chest. It's just not a reality. So if we know that survivability was way too high and they nerfed that across the board, and that damage was way too high, so they nerfed your reliance on crit and vulnerable damage, what about the other changes that are kind of systemic to how they approached balancing the classes? And I think here is where there are a lot more valid arguments for what is and isn't good. I personally don't believe that Bone Spear needed to be nerfed, because I don't think that any Necromancer build actually overperforms over the vast majority of other classes in this game, with the exception of Sorceress, obviously. That being said, though, regardless of how healthy it is, or regardless of how balanced the game was, the vast majority of players were playing Bone Spear. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It was kind of like the Hammerdin from Diablo 2 for the Paladin. Why would I run other builds that are harder to understand, require better gear, and aren't as simple or repetitive to play when I can play Bone Spear and blow up the entire screen? That isn't a healthy meta. Now again, while I don't think that they needed to nerf Bone Spear to approach the healthy meta, we can all agree that one build having like a huge stakehold in how many people are playing it over every other build ultimately is a very stale meta. Like, if you're willing to be objective about it, that just is a true statement. Now, let me chime in here with some ways that I think that they inappropriately attempted to nerf the builds. One, they put in a pretty sizable nerf to Grasping Veins. This is the aspect that says you gain crit damage and critical strike chance after casting Corpse Tendrils. Now, it's obviously an incredibly powerful tool for Bone Spear. It's one of its biggest multipliers. The issue is that it is one of the only tools for all of the other Necromancer builds to actually generate crit chance and actually generate crit damage. Not only that, it's one of the few multipliers in this game that works with overpower. And while I think that that's absolutely a bug, it doesn't change the fact that overpower damage is absolute crap if you start removing multipliers from it. So in an effort to reduce our reliance on Grasping Veins, they have nerfed it. And while that mathematically has the biggest impact on bone builds, I believe that it truly has the biggest impact on all these other builds that had fewer tools and don't have as great passives to be able to get these similar stats in their gear or in their Paragon. And this attempt to balance the top end is negatively impacting the bottom end. I actually feel similarly about that as it pertains to things like crit and vulnerable damage. Yes, these were absolutely way too powerful on Bone Spear in comparison to the rest of the Necromancer. And I bet you, as you're listening to me rant on right now, you're coming up with your own examples. And again, I think that those are valid. But now that we've talked about the damage and we've talked about the survivability, let's talk about the, and I'm doing air quotes here, issue that the developers had. And it's that we completely trivialized all of their content. Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons, something that while very few people have done it, a sizable amount of the player base has accomplished over a multitude of different builds. Woody has run multiple tier 100 dungeons on hardcore rogue at this point. What does it mean that 1 month into the game existing, the hardest content in the game is able to be farmed in so many different ways? Well, it means that that benchmark, that quote unquote hardest content in the game, already cannot scale to meet the addition of new power into the game. The Malignant Hearts in Season 1 absolutely have the potential to be bananas level of damage and survivability increase. If you've checked out the patch notes, they are incredibly strong. So how can they possibly add all of this additional power into the game when we are already clearing the content that exists? We have already trivialized it. There were people 2 weeks into when this game came out saying that they had min-maxed the gear, they had nothing else to do, and they were power farming tier 80s, and there was no reason for them to play the game anymore. I'm not saying that progression needs to be artificially long or that the hardest content in the game should be completely unapproachable for the majority of the player base. That is not what I'm saying at all. But there should be a reward for playing the incredible, grindy, slash and loot genre that is ARPGs. We need goals to aspire to. We need builds to be able to min-max. We need to be able to, constantly search for one piece of gear that might have a single stat that's a little bit higher. And that means we need to go find the perfect aspect to replace it and then farm up enough gold to be able to enchant it. That's the core loop of an ARPG, at the very least for me. And I don't want to pretend like this is for everybody or this definition fits everybody's idea of fun. But if they didn't rebalance the game, because everybody is seeing this patch as a big nerf, everything got nerfed, it's nerfed. What this is a balance. It's a full game balance approach. They said we need to look at all of the outstanding pain points and bring them all back down to earth so that we have any space to grow and expand in interesting ways that aren't just strictly increasing the numbers. One of the biggest things that the nebulous concept of the internet, and by internet here I mean mostly Reddit comments, has been afraid of is that the game won't have enough to offer. Everything will be trivial. There'll be no reason to play it, nothing to grind, no content to do. That there will be power creep, that everything will have to one-up itself, that we'll get to quote-unquote Diablo 3 numbers. Do you remember those complaints when we've all been reading them online? Some of us saying them ourselves or parroting them ourselves? For some reason, now that we've gotten this balance patch, now that we've gotten this pretty hefty array of nerfs, that's not true anymore. It's my power was taken away. It's my power fantasy was taken away. It is, they have made it so that my build is weaker. I'm getting a little preachy here, but sincerely, when you're looking at the changes that have come in this balance patch, I would just like it if people could ask the question, do I think 1 year from now, we will be in a better place because the devs were willing to do this right now? They were willing to tear off the bandage right now so that when it is a year from now, when it's 2024 and my birthday is coming back around, we're not sitting here going, oh, Diablo 4 had really good bones, had a really good premise. I just wish they didn't allow all that power creep to come into play. I wish it wasn't so bloated. Everything's completely trivial. There's no way that they can balance the builds now. It's too powerful. Is that really where we want to be? And while I typically hate the slippery slope, argument style here, the fear of what could be, that's sincerely the thing that kills ARPGs. It's when you show up one time, you haven't played for a season or two, and you walk in and there's 50 new merchants all selling a million different currencies. You have no idea what's going on. All the numbers are 5 times what they were before. And the build that you thought was good is like so completely irrelevant because of the things that they've added that it's impossible for you to intuit what you're supposed to do. That is the thing that kills ARPGs. That's just in general, games that are meant to have extremely long tails of valuable and fun grinding cannot start at the point that Diablo 4 has started at. Because if we're being sincere with ourselves, hitting 8-digit damage numbers the first week of this game being released is not an easy place to continue to scale from. I think that this was ultimately a very good change for the game, at least for its overall health. While the amount of fun that you're having right now might seem like it will be negatively impacted, I promise you, or at the very least, I expect that when we get down the road, we get another season under our belt here, and we look back, we'll go, that was a good change that ultimately made it so that they could continue to expand the design space and not limit us and pigeonhole us into just ever-increasing numbers with ever-increasing multipliers, with near infinite immunity and near infinite survivability so that nothing matters anymore. That's it. That's really all that I got. I truly hope that that helps put it into a little bit of perspective right now. Again, I'm not trying to be an apologist for the decisions of the developers. It's their game. It's their art. They can make it how they want. I can have dissenting opinions and I can share those dissenting opinions. But just because I bought a game doesn't mean I get to determine how the artists make their art. Luckily for us, the developers are constantly taking our feedback. They are sincerely listening to what we say. I can promise you, I get to talk to them pretty often, and they care deeply about this game. I'm not going to put words into their mouth for them. That's not my place. But at the end of the day, there is a team of artists out there who are trying to make a game that lives up to the name of the Diablo franchise, and they're making decisions that they think are ultimately best for it. So if you are sharing criticisms, if you do have concerns, if you do have issues with specific ways that things are implemented, come up with a good thesis, present it well, put it on the forums, try to gain support. But if all you're doing is just kind of screaming that your own personal build isn't strong enough anymore, just understand that that's probably not going to really gain you any traction and probably won't actually affect the change that you want to see in the world. Thank you very much for listening to just another person on the internet sharing just their opinion about whether or not you should like a video game. And I truly hope that it helps. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.